Welcome to another UND Aerocast episode. Today we will be discussing checklist procedures and how these procedures relate to SRM, or Single Pilot Resource Management, and CRM, or Crew Resource Management. Single Pilot Resource Management refers to the effective use of all available resources, for instance, human resources, such as weather briefers, dispatchers, and other pilots, and even hardware, such as the aircraft avionics and navigational aids, and any other information the pilot deems necessary to ensure the safety of that flight. Crew Resource Management is similar to SRM, except the pilot in command has an additional crew member to assist with cockpit procedures and decision-making. Proper checklist procedures help to ensure every flight is a safe and efficient one. They keep the pilot focused on the task at hand while ensuring the aircraft is configured correctly for each phase of flight. In an effort to better prepare our students for the next phase of their flying careers, UND uses standardized checklist procedures similar to those used by airlines throughout the world. Now, the objective of this UND Aerocast episode is to develop the pilot's knowledge, ability, professionalism, confidence, and competence when performing aircraft procedures in accordance with the appropriate checklist. The pilot will also develop a high level of safety awareness while executing these procedures. During the first few hours of training in a new course, or when transitioning to a new aircraft, flight crews at UND will utilize Chapter 1, Amplified Checklist Procedures, as published in the appropriate aircraft standardization manual in lieu of and as a supplement to the abbreviated checklist. Referring to the details contained in the expanded checklist procedures during the beginning stage of training ensures a thorough knowledge regarding what to specifically look for while using the abbreviated checklist during following lessons. In Chapter 1 of UND's Cessna 172 Standardization Manual, the expanded checklist procedures explain two different approaches to completing a checklist. These are known as do lists and flow patterns. When completing a do list, the pilot completes the checklist step by step in order while reading directly from the checklist.
Standby battery annunciator was on.
Pre-flight, engine start, run-up, shutdown, and post-flight checklists are all do lists. A flow pattern, on the other hand, is a two-step process. The pilot first configures the cockpit by completing a memorized sequence through the cockpit controls. Upon completing the flow, the pilot then verifies these checklist items by referencing the appropriate checklist.
Set. Engine instruments are all good. Fuel selectors on both and approach briefing is complete.
Let's take a look at the various checklist procedures used during a typical training flight to the practice area in UND's Cessna 172. On our first flight, the student will perform checklist procedures using SRM, or Single Pilot Resource Management. During single pilot operations, the pilot, generally the student, assumes the roles of both the pilot flying and pilot monitoring. He or she is solely responsible for the completion and verification of each do list and flow pattern. The vast majority of your training at UND requires the demonstration and development of your single pilot resource management skills. This includes proper cockpit management and correct checklist procedures. Let's watch our students as they demonstrate correct SRM procedures from pre-flight to post-flight. The pre-flight inspection for all UND aircraft is a do list. There are two parts to every pre-flight inspection: the interior pre-flight and the exterior pre-flight. With the extensive list of items which need to be checked during pre-flight, the standardization manual requires the pilot to reference every item on the checklist in sequential order. Failure to do so may result in a situation which may compromise the safety of flight. The pilot must also ensure the following documents are on board their flight: airworthiness and federal registration, state registration, if required, FCC license, if required, aircraft-specific POH with current weight and balance information, minimum equipment list specific to the aircraft's tail number, and any supplemental documents such as GPS manuals. To assist in the safe and efficient completion of your flight, Proper cockpit management skills must be employed in conjunction with proper checklist procedures. Upon completion of the interior and exterior pre-flight procedures, take a few moments to organize your cockpit. Cockpit organization can include the following: ensuring any loose items in the cabin or the cockpit are secured. Chocks are secured by tie-down straps in the baggage compartment. The tow bar is installed and properly stowed. Charts, flight computers, or any other items required for your flight are properly stowed but easily accessible when required for use. In addition, do not place any items on the glare shield. This allows for maximum forward visibility for both pilot and flight instructor, and also prevents permanently damaging the windscreen. Now it's time to go flying. The before start checklist is a flow pattern and therefore must be committed to memory. According to FAR 91.3, the pilot in command of an aircraft is directly responsible for and is the final authority as to the operation of that aircraft. The pilot in command is required to operate the aircraft in a safe manner and ensure the safety of the passengers. Passengers, therefore, must be given a thorough passenger briefing prior to departure. The Cessna 172 Standardization Manual outlines the following items as mandatory for the passenger briefing: use of seat belts and shoulder harnesses, location and operation of emergency exits, location and use of the fire extinguisher, and a reminder that there is no smoking, eating, or drinking on any UND flight.
Before start checklist, passenger briefing. Seat belts and harnesses. Ensure that the buckle goes into the fastener to adjust pull-up for security. Ensure that the stitching is to the outside for airbag deployment. Keep fastened throughout all phases of flight. 2 emergency exits are located on this aircraft, one to the left, one to the right. To operate, lift up on the latch, push out on the door. To close, pull in, push down, verify that it is locked. Fire extinguisher is located between the 2 front seats. To operate, unsecure by lifting the 2 latches, remove the pin, and aim at the base of the fire for maximum effectiveness.
The pilot's seat should be positioned to assure full rudder and brake movement. Ensure the seat is securely latched to the seat tracks. The seat back should also be placed in its most upright position. Ensure the seat belts are securely fastened with the stitching facing outwards. This ensures the airbags will deploy outward and provide maximum protection in the unlikely event of an uncontrolled forced landing. Ensure all cabin doors are closed and latched. When closing the doors, do not slam them as it may damage the latching mechanism. The windows may be unlatched and open during taxi for better ventilation. To prevent damaging the radios and electrical equipment, the pilot must ensure that they are off prior to testing the standby battery.
Radios and electrical equipment are all off.
Hold in the test position for 20 seconds. The green light adjacent the switch should remain illuminated through the test. Following this test, the switch should be moved to the arm position. Once the standby battery switch is moved to the arm position, the essential bus should be powered. As a result, the PFD screen should power up. Once the PFD has finished loading, the engine indicating system should be checked. The pilot is looking at engine parameters such as oil temperature and fuel quantity. The pilot should also ensure no red X's appear over any of the engine indicating instruments. Please note, other components may have red X's over them. During this checklist item, our primary concern is verifying the operation of the engine indicating system. Once the avionics buses are switched on, these X's should disappear. Essential bus volts. The pilot should verify a minimum of 24 volts are shown. Main bus volts. The pilot should verify no more than 1.5 volts are shown. Standby battery amps. The pilot should verify a discharge is shown. Standby battery annunciator. Illuminated. Alternator and battery master switches. Verify both switches on. Aircraft lights. For flights during the day, both beacon and strobe lights should be turned on. For night operations, beacon and navigation lights are required. Fuel shutoff valve. The fuel shutoff valve should be verified on by confirming the knob is pushed full in. Upon completion of this flow pattern, the pilot must verify accuracy by referring to the printed checklist. The pilot should verbalize each item while visually confirming its appropriate condition or position. For example,
passenger briefing complete. Seats are adjusted and locked. Belts and harnesses, everyone is secure. Radios and electric equipment was off. Standby battery, we tested. PFD is on, no red X's. Essential bus volts, minimum of 24. Main bus volts were 1.5 or less. Standby battery annunciator was on and is on. Alt and battery switches are on. Lights, beacon and strobe, and the fuel valve is in.
After verifying the flow, the pilot will announce,
"Before start checklist complete."
This example of a flow pattern demonstrates two key elements. First, the proper procedure for completing and verifying a flow pattern. Second, it illustrates the detail contained in Chapter 1, Expanded Checklist Procedures. This attention to detail is why it is so important to use the expanded procedures in the beginning stages of training as a supplement to the abbreviated checklist. All engine start checklists are do lists and must be completed step by step while referencing the appropriate checklist. During engine start, do not move the throttle while cranking the engine. Such actions may allow too much fuel into the engine during start, thus flooding the engine, or may even lead to an engine fire. Always follow manufacturer guidelines with respect to starting procedures and cranking periods. For the Skyhawk, Cessna recommends limiting starter cranking times to 10 seconds with a 20-second cooldown period between attempts. After 3 cycles, the starter should be allowed to cool for 10 minutes.
Drop clear!
After completing the engine start do list, the student shall commence the after engine start flow pattern. After switching the avionics bus 1 and 2 switches to the on position, the engine must be leaned. Using the amplified procedures in the standardization manual, we know the procedure is as follows. The throttle is increased to 1200 RPM. Next, the mixture is slowly leaned until a peak in RPMs is reached. Finally, the throttle is returned to 1000 RPM. Following flap retraction, the pilot verifies the flow pattern by announcing and visually checking every item while referring to the after engine start checklist.
After engine start checklist, we'll verify engine instruments are good. Avionics bus 1 and 2 are now on. Mixture is leaned and flaps are retracted after engine start checklist complete.
Prior to taxiing, the before taxi flow pattern must be accomplished. After ensuring the database is current, set the current fuel load into the totalizer using the MFD soft keys. As a means of gaining proficiency with the auto load feature of the Garmin 1000, the UND standardization manual requires navigation and communication frequencies be loaded from the waypoint page. Next, check the status of GPS satellite reception on the 3rd page of the aux page group. Additionally, all UND flights require a flight plan to be loaded into the flight plan page. After receiving your ATIS information, the altimeter setting can be adjusted on the PFD using the Barrow knob and also set in the standby altimeter. Prior to taxi, obtain your clearance.
That's affirmed. We do have India 213, standard taxi for runway 17 left, and we'll hold short of Charlie.
After setting in the assigned squawk code into the transponder, verify the flow pattern, then clear the area and commence taxi.
Taxi, fixed release, engine instruments are in the green. Flight instruments are good. They're clear right, clear left, going left, my brakes are good.
Brake effectiveness must be checked prior to taxi. If the brake effectiveness does not satisfy the pilot in command, he or she should discontinue the flight.
I have the flight controls.
And contact maintenance personnel. While taxiing on any ramp, the pilot should be focused on his or her surroundings. Also, a ground speed of no more than 5 knots should be observed while taxiing in congested areas. With so much activity, it is important for the pilot to ensure they are clear of the ramp area prior to beginning the instrument cockpit check. At the pilot's discretion, to enhance collision avoidance during taxi at night or during restricted visibility conditions, any lights may be used to increase aircraft visibility. Once the instruments have been checked, the flow pattern is verified.
Instrument cockpit check complete. Taxi checklist complete.
The run-up is a do list and should be completed in order, step by step, to ensure all items are completed correctly.
Parking brake is set. Circuit breakers are all in. Mixture is rich. Throttle up.
Prior to taking the active runway, the before takeoff flow pattern is completed up to, but not including, the final checklist item, aircraft lights. When verifying the flow pattern with the checklist, the pilot shall state,
Before takeoff, briefing complete. Lights are on standby, and we'll verify that.
use of the told card printed from Ames is designed to expedite your before takeoff briefing. It has been organized to include the same elements and sequence from the cockpit briefing section in the printed checklist.
Takeoff briefing. Our takeoff runway is runway 17 left. Takeoff distance is 1,100 feet. Runway length 3,901 feet. Liftoff speed is 55. Initial climb speed is 74. Initial heading and altitude is 2,500 and runway heading. Course and heading will be standard UND departure procedures. Destination is the Crookston Airport. Emergency below VR will perform the emergency below VR checklist. Emergency above VR checklist. Any questions?
When taxiing onto the active runway for departure, the pulse light must be turned on during the day, and landing and taxi lights must be used during night operations. The pilot now states,
Before takeoff checklist complete.
during the takeoff roll, the pilot makes the following airspeed callouts. When the airspeed tape begins to move, the pilot announces, airspeed alive.
Cleared for takeoff. Airspeed's alive.
Once airspeed reaches 40 knots, they must announce,
40 knots.
once obtaining the calculated rotation speed, the pilot announces,
Rotate.
workload permitting, the climb flow is normally completed at 1,000 feet AGL. Flaps are verified up, and the pulse light is on during climb for day and night operations. Cessna recommends the mixture remains at full rich at any altitude below 3,000 feet. Above 3,000 feet, the pilot may begin to lean out the mixture to enhance engine performance. Upon completion of the flow, the checklist is verified.
Alright, climb checklist. Flaps are up. Mixer's rich. Lights are set. Climb checklist complete.
During the climb, the pilot must make the following altitude callouts. For example, today's flight will cruise at 2,500 feet on the altimeter. Beginning 1,000 feet below the desired cruise altitude, the pilot announces,
1,500 for 2,500.
with 500 feet remaining in the climb, the pilot announces,
2,000 for 2,500.
once they level off at the 2,500 foot mark, the pilot announces,
Level 2,500.
after setting the cruise power, the mixture should be leaned. To access the lean assist feature, press the engine soft key, then the lean soft key, followed by the assist soft key. Once this screen on the engine indicating page is active, begin slowly leaning the mixture until the EGT peaks and the temperature shown is a negative value. Then, enrichen the mixture until the peak EGT value is 0 for best economy, or continue to enrichen until the temperature is 50 degrees rich of peak for what Cessna has termed recommended lean. Next, select pulse light off. If in-flight visibility is less than 5 statute miles or traffic congestion is high, the light will remain on. Once the remaining cruise flow items are complete, the checklist is verified.
We'll verify that. Cruise power set. Mixture is leaned. Aircraft lights. And pitot heat is off. Cruise checklist complete.
The descent checklist shall be initiated upon the commencement of the initial descent to land and shall be completed prior to 5 nautical miles of the selected airport of landing. Again, the pulse light is to be turned on during day and night operations. The flow is to be verified with the checklist following the completion of the flow pattern. During descent, the same format for altitude callouts used during the climb is again required. For example, if today's flight is descending to 2,500 feet MSL, beginning 1,000 feet above the desired altitude, the pilot announces
3,500 for 2,500.
With 500 feet remaining in the descent, the pilot announces
3,000 for 2,500.
Once they have leveled off at 2,100 feet, the pilot announces
Level 2,500.
the before landing checklist must be initiated prior to midfield downwind or 1 mile from the runway threshold if entering on a base or final leg. During daytime operations, the pulse light will be selected on during the before landing flow pattern. At night, the landing and taxi lights will be used. The flow is to be verified following the completion of the flow pattern.
Seat backs most upright. Seat belts are secured. Fuel selectors on both. Mixtures rich. Chem power 12 volts off. Before landing checklist complete.
In order to satisfy the stabilized approach criteria, a final check must be accomplished prior to landing and prior to reaching 100 feet AGL by verifying the final status of the flaps.
Flap set full. Final check complete.
Do not perform the after landing flow pattern until the aircraft comes to a complete stop, clears the runway, and clears the hold short line. During the day, the beacon and strobe lights should be the only lights which remain on. At night, beacon and nav lights. However, any lights may be used to increase visibility should an unforeseen vehicle approach your aircraft.
Dispatch 213 back, no discrepancies.
The shutdown and post-flight checklists are do lists. A thorough post-flight is just as important as a thorough pre-flight. Remember to complete your post-flight procedure using your checklist every time. Now that we have watched an entire flight's checklist procedures executed during single pilot operations, let's take a closer look at how do lists and flow patterns are performed in a crew environment. Although you will be evaluated as a single pilot during your commercial training here at UND, CRM procedures are required on specific lessons during the multi-engine training course, and crew operations are an integral part of the CRJ course. You and your instructor are encouraged to occasionally function as a crew during your single-engine training. Practicing these checklist procedures now will result in an easy transition to crew operations during your multi-engine and CRJ training courses, or wherever your aviation career may take you. During crew operations, it must be predetermined who is assuming the responsibilities of pilot flying and pilot monitoring. Here at UND, the student will generally assume the pilot flying role. As with single pilot operations, two types of checklists exist: do lists and flow patterns. When completing a do list as a crew, the pilot flying will call for a specific checklist at the time it needs to be performed. For example, the pilot flying will call for the engine start cold checklist. The pilot monitoring will begin at the top of the checklist and call out each item in order. The pilot monitoring then waits for the pilot flying to perform the corresponding checklist action and then call out the appropriate response. The crew then continues step by step in this fashion until the entire checklist is completed.
Alright, engine start cold. Throttle. Quarter inch open. Fuel pump on. Mixture rich. Then idle cutoff. Fuel pump off. Propeller area. Clear. We're clear right. Straight left. Clear. Magnetos. Start. Mixture rich. Throttle 1,000 RPM. Oil pressure. Oil pressure is in the green. Amps Positive.
Low volts annunciator.
Is extinguished.
Once the entire checklist is completed, the pilot monitoring will announce,
Engine start checklist is complete.
the flow pattern is to be initiated by the pilot flying, without any prompting from the pilot monitoring. Once the flow pattern is complete, the pilot flying will call for the appropriate checklist. The pilot monitoring then starts at the beginning of the checklist and waits for a specific response from the pilot flying. This response is the checklist item's present condition or position. After the response is given, the pilot monitoring continues to the next item. This process is repeated until all checklist items are complete. Upon completion, the pilot monitoring will announce the checklist is complete. Let's watch the crew perform the before takeoff checklist.
Cabin doors are both latched. Takeoff briefing. Alright, Justin. We are taking off on runway 17 left. Takeoff distance today is 1,100 feet. Runway length 3,901 feet. Liftoff speed today will be 55 knots. Initial climb speed will be 74. Our initial heading will be runway heading up to 2,500 feet. Then we will proceed on our UND published departure procedure. Destination today is Crookston. Emergency below VR will perform the emergency below VR checklist. Emergency above VR will perform the emergency above VR checklist. In the event of any emergency, I'll have the flight controls, you'll have the radios, and the checklist. Do you have any questions?
No questions.
Excellent. Before takeoff checklist?
Flight controls.
Green correct.
Trim.
Set for takeoff?
Flaps.
Set to 10.
Mixture.
Rich?
Pitot heat.
Off.
Cabin power 12 volt switch.
Off.
Altitude and heading bugs.
Set.
Transponder.
Set to 0102.
Cabin door and window.
Both are closed and latched.
Takeoff briefing.
Is complete.
Aircraft lights.
On standby.
Before takeoff checklist complete.
Alright.
Students are encouraged to utilize all available resources when practicing checklist procedures. Online checklist trainers allow you to practice checklists in a simulated cockpit environment. Wall posters, or simply sitting in the actual aircraft with a power card attached, are also an excellent means of practicing flow patterns. Using these resources in conjunction with the expanded procedures section of the Aircraft Standardization Manual will help you to master checklist procedures. Common use of the procedures outlined in this Aerocast episode will aid you and your crew in completing a safe and efficient flight every time. And hopefully, by mastering UND standardized checklist procedures, you will ensure success on your next pilot evaluation. From everyone at UND Aerospace and the staff of the UND Aerocast, we wish you all the best with the rest of your flight training. Have fun and fly safe.
Do I really have to prompt you? Airspeed alive, 49. Have you ever done this in an airplane before?
Anyway, here we go.